In this video, I talk with Dan Bragen, student at Susquehanna University, and Alan Grant, professor of economics, and we discuss economic lessons from a clip from the Game of Thrones. This is part of a longer video the three of us created, so if you enjoy this, please check out the longer video. Also, we've collaborated on the website econthrones.com, where there are a number of clips that teach economic concepts from the Game of Thrones. So I hope you like that. Check out that website. And without further ado, let's get to our discussion.
Ned Umma. Alice Carstock. For centuries, our families fought side by side on the battlefield. I ask you to pledge your loyalty once again to House Stark, to serve as our bannermen and come to our aid whenever called upon. Stand. Yesterday's wars don't matter anymore. The North needs to band together. All the living North. Will you stand beside me, Ned and Alice, now and always?
Now and always.
Okay. I don't know if we could officially say they were drafted into the Stark army, but I seem to suspect they did not have very much of a choice in their decision to say now and always they're going to be defending House Stark. How can we kind of place this in the context of economic history?
I think, when you look at the history of economists, Milton Friedman, famous one that comes to mind, his strong opposition to the military draft, and I believe his successful work in order to get it abolished. I believe he had a debate with the defense, not Minister of Defense, the Defense Department head, in which he sort of embarrassed him in a cabinet meeting and changed their minds a lot on the draft. And I was just kind of thinking about Milton Friedman's work in that. I went through and reading some of it, and I found kind of an interesting class analysis almost of the military draft in regards to, when it comes to a military draft, the rich are able to kind of get around that, not by necessarily buying their way out of it, but deferments via college and things like that. And the poor are typically more sick than the average population. So there's a huge unfair burden put on the middle class who aren't rich enough to get out of sort of get these deferments, but also wealthy enough to where they're not very sick. So you kind of looks at this like unfair cost imposed on the middle class with the draft. I think Milton Friedman's very interesting in regards to the military draft.
Yeah, and the panel, it was kind of interesting. I believe it was him and Alan Greenspan on a panel appointed by Nixon. So I will say I was born slightly after the Nixon administration, so I did not get to live through the joys of that. And you hear, right? I mean, obviously there's Watergate, but the panel was created, and yeah, he was accused of, the general said, "I don't want a mercenary army," and Friedman's response was, "Well, I'm a mercenary economist, and here are some mercenary lawyers." Right? I mean, like we're everybody's mercenary for what they like on that. But yeah, economists and their role in ending the military draft, I think, is really an admirable thing. It's one that kind of might be a high point of our profession, right, in terms of a contribution to society.
Yes, and I think the arguments against the draft, or if you go back in time to the middle 1960s, the arguments for the draft, there's an equity argument for the draft, that it's not fair that all the burden should be borne by these people, and the wealthy people can buy their way out of it, or choose not to enlist. I think people that have better open market opportunities. But I think one of the other arguments in the 1960s in favor of the draft was, well, the draft is really cheap. We can force these people to come here and we don't have to pay them peanuts. And that's why we should have a draft, because it's so inexpensive. And I think the economists did a brilliant job in the 1960s, Lee Hansen, Walter Oy, Milton Friedman, saying, listen, just because they're cheap in dollar terms doesn't mean they're cheap in terms of lost opportunities. And that when you take society's more productive market producers and put them on the battlefield somewhere, you really lose something more than just their paycheck.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thinking about it from a couple different point of views. One, there's the costs of the war. And instead of it being spread out through society, it's on the group that is forced to fight, which they could be spread out for society more if you're willing to pay market wages, to get the the mercenary army that Friedman talked about. But I think there's another interesting part by having a draft. I don't know if I'm thinking out loud here, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I mean, it's almost in some ways like it's not a market, but it's in some ways then it cause a market failure because too much war would be produced, because for the vast majority of society, the army is cheaper. It's you're not having to pay market rates to soldiers, or you're not once you're past draft age, you're not threatened by having to be forced to enlist at no cost, no wages. So you're like, oh yeah, we can send the other people. It might increase the probability of a draftable event occurring.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty interesting in the context of today's Russia-Ukraine thing that you can make another argument against the draft too, that when you draft people, they're not very enthused and very high quality soldiers for you. So we've got these 300,000 soldiers called up in Russia recently to go fight in the battlefields of Ukraine. And by all accounts, they're ill-equipped, ill-motivated, and not very well trained.
I think the military draft and the economics behind it are really interesting, because it's a nice cross section of where sort of political economic arguments about freedom and sort of the foundations of the United States government, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as well as just the economics of the situation in a normative and positive sense, sort of interlink, and our intuitions about the draft and our feelings about freedom also align with the economics and the positive aspect of it. I think is an interesting example.